Okay, let's talk a little bit about Chapter 9. And Chapter 9 should be a relatively quick chapter, a little quick study. Again, we're dealing with contracts, and we get into a little bit of agency at the end, and it's some of the issues regarding contracts, interpretation, performance, breach, etc., etc. Oops, I got the wrong spot there. Let's go back. So let's see, all contracts, it says here, this goes back to last chapter, but all contracts to be valid and enforceable must be in writing and signed by the parties to the agreement. True or false? Say false. Remember we discussed that no, in fact, oral contracts are perfectly enforceable, and so are implied contracts that, might not have even an oral agreement necessarily, right? But the conduct is implied, and so it can be enforced. So interpretation, right? It's a matter of law. There's some rules that help us, but oftentimes they're not black and white. Okay. Ordinary meaning, we talk about, ordinary language we would deal with in most normal contracts is basically what they're saying there. But trade usage too. We use terms, plumbers and electricians and contractors, they may have terms that they would use in the trade, and it's okay to use those in contracts, and we're going to interpret the contract based on the trade usage of those terms. I suppose jewelers or jewelry stores and those types of things, they all have special terms, and doctors and la-da-da. Priority of terms, so top priority might be things that are handwritten. So oftentimes if we have a contract that may be printed, but there's handwritten notes on the side, we're going to look at those handwritten notes and interpret those, and especially if both parties initial those and whatnot, they're going to be given some priority over the printed or the typed. Okay. Then you've got the typed stuff, and again, if you had a printed form, say contract, but they typed in some information, okay, that would basically take a priority, or you'd interpret it first, or give it a higher priority. Yep. And then lastly, the printed contract itself. And again, these are written contracts, and if you have written contracts, the oral contracts take seconds. We talked about the parole evidence rule. I think we bring that up again, but then they would lack relevance if that were the case, if you did have a written contract. Okay, so oral contracts more stand on their own versus when they're in conjunction with any kind of a written contract. And that's basically what we're talking about here. And we talked about that in the last chapter, and it doesn't really change. That when you complete a contract, the oral evidence isn't really going to help. It's going to be disregarded. Okay, so again, we have usual meaning for common words. These are some of the rules, right? Specialized meaning for specialized trade, depending against what that is. We're also going to interpret things. The courts have decided as part of their rules, they're going to interpret things against the party that's drafting, right? So if you have a party that drafted the contract and you're in dispute over maybe some of the language or something that's in there, they're probably going to look at the party that drafted it and say that, they might have put that in there to better their interests. And so the general rule is to go against that party that drafted, and same thing with any handwritten notes that might be on there. The person that actually wrote those notes, the courts are going to initially at least look at that and say that they would interpret it against that person. So again, we have a duty to perform, and much like with tort, right? So we've got the things that we talked about last chapter, where we've got an offer and acceptance and those types of things. If we have an agreement, we have a contract, and we have a duty to perform by both parties, right? Probably the paying party and the payee party. Okay, what's the first and most important place to look to determine what parties to a contract agreed to? Probably the words of the contract, right? Because probably it's going to be the words of the contract. Notes from negotiating sessions, those are separate from the contract, right? Their current statements, that's kind of parole evidence, right? So we're going to go look at the contract if it's in fact written. So conditions. We might often put conditions into contracts. condition precedent, condition subsequent, or condition concurrent. It just deals with what the conditions might be. So we might have a contract, say, to buy somebody's property, but we're concerned that the roof needs to be fixed, and given the recent storms and whatnot, that could be the case. And so we might sign a contract that says, okay, we agree to purchase the property if the roof is fixed, right? Okay, well, that's a condition precedent because it has to be done before the contract will actually take place. A condition subsequent would mean that the performance of something would take place after, right, after the signage or after the signing of the contract, and you might set aside some money for fixing the roof or something, and the actual fixing of it would take place afterwards. Okay, so that would be a condition subsequent, and a condition concurrent might be something that would occur at the time of we're hard to come up with a good example when you're talking about real estate, but we'll deliver to you the keys to the house. That's pretty minor and pretty simple, but it might be something as simple as that, right? And we'll do that at the time of closing. Okay. Well, a lot of the conditions concurrent, let me go back to that, might be things like title insurance, okay, which guarantees then that the property's free and clear, and that would occur at the time of the actual the actual signing or the closing of the real estate loan. So you can have some things like that might happen. Some other condition precedents might be, an appraisal of the property would have to be done beforehand. Okay. Again, conditions of performance can be both express and implied, and we've talked about the different types of contracts. These are obviously written right in the contract, but implied, you get into things like, hey, fix my front wheel, it's squeaking. It implies that you want them to kind of do whatever it takes then, right? Or if you go to the doctor and you say, I'm sick, right? It implies that you want them to fix you. Okay. So order of performance, you look to the contract. This is talking about payment here, I believe. Okay. If not addressed, then payment should normally be before delivery. And you and I know that from the contracts that we enter into, right? If we go to Amazon, we press the submit button, we got to give them our credit card information if they don't already have it, right? And then they're getting paid right away, okay? And then they'll actually deliver the goods. So and it talks about delivery, UCC gap fillers. I believe what that's talking about is that the UCC, or Uniform Commercial Code, kind of fills in, and it kind of explains then in all the states what constitutes delivery, okay, what constitutes delivery, and when and how that's going to take place, and those are all addressed in that law. I don't know that we get into that real deep, and I don't think on the test probably at all. And tender means to make goods available, right? So if you tender that and you bring it forward and they bring their money, you're right there and you're ready to go, right? Both sides, but the tender means to make the goods available so that the transaction could take place. Levels of performance would include complete, did everything that was required, substantial, but it means that most everything was done, but maybe fell a little bit short. And then material breach would be not anything that's acceptable, right? Okay, so complete. I like to think in terms of construction contracts, because we had a lot of these that we did through the bank and whatnot, right? And somebody fulfills it all and they've built the place, well, they're entitled to get paid, right? Substantial might mean that they finished everything, but it got to be fall and they couldn't finish the landscaping, and it's substantial. They might have to, maybe they'll come back and do it in the spring. Maybe they'll just not finish that part of it, okay? Because maybe you want to close the house and get her going, close the deal, sign the contracts, finance, do whatever you need to do, right? And so that they would still be considered substantial, and they would be entitled to get paid at least for everything, maybe except that landscaping then, if that were part of the contract, right? So they finished 95% of the house. If it was a $100,000 house, they'd probably get entitled to pay to be paid that $95,000, and you could keep the $5,000 then to finish the landscaping in the spring and either have them do it or somebody else, right? Okay, and so we call that substantial. And then material breach is, yeah, maybe they came and dug the hole for the basement. Okay, now they're probably not entitled to anything in a case like that. Okay, so different levels there. Divisibility of performance, right? Contract segments, and so some things can be divided up. A performance for a certain, if you're hiring a consultant, say, right, and you might divide that up into, we're going to have the consultant here, and from January to January, February, or January, February, March. So the first quarter, right, we're going to pay him. In the second quarter, we'll pay him. In the third quarter, and the fourth quarter, okay. As long as they accomplish what we want them to, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you're technically dividing it up, right? And they're going to perform what you've asked them to do in each of the quarters, and you can divide that. They draw a distinction between things. I often, because in fact when I first read this, I thought they were crazy, because in banking we often divided the payments for construction contracts. And what do I mean by that? Well, in bigger construction contracts, say if it was a couple $1,000,000 or something, well, the contractor obviously probably can't afford to carry that himself and wait until the very end to get paid. He's got to pay for supplies, his help, and everything, right? So usually what would happen is there would be an architect that would be assigned to the contract, and when the contractor got done to a certain portion, then the person that had contracted them would allow for payment, and the bank would advance the funds and whatnot, right, after everything was all certified. Okay, that was fairly typical, but that's not considered a divisible, because you still expect the full contract to be completed, right? Whereas dividing things up like a consultant, you expect them to do what that they need to in that particular quarter, but it may not be for a full year, right? You may kick them out after 6 months or something, right? And so you can kind of divide up the performance and the payment in that case. Whereas in a construction, it's not considered divisible. Discharge. A party can be released from obligation, right? Certainly if they complete their performance, right? If they tender their performance but it's rejected, right? So they show up and they're willing to do the work and whatnot, and somebody rejects it, and I've actually seen that happen in some cases, right? Impossibility of performance. And this, think about somebody dying, right? And I know that we often don't think of death as being maybe an impossibility, but yeah, if you were a contractor, a head of a firm, and it's a small firm, and you die, it might make it very much impossible for you to complete the performance, or the company, or anything. And so you could, the company and the heirs and those types of things would not be forced necessarily to perform that. You get into bigger corporations and it's a whole another deal, right? Because you've got different layers of management, and even if the CEO goes down, they're probably going to be forced to complete whatever type of contract there might be. Commercial impracticability is a little lesser burden of proof. But think about folks that might be building something and they rely on raw materials, and if they can't get those raw materials, again, if we'll out here at Central Machine, they're going to build you some things, and you've contracted with them, and you expect them to be done, but all of a sudden they can't get in certain metal, or maybe they can't get in the welding rod that you require or that you want for that project. Okay, those types of things might create a commercial impracticability that would allow them to be discharged. It's through no fault of their own, right? But it just couldn't happen. Now, if they could reasonably get it from another supplier, yeah, another story, right? Okay, waiver and release, and the book kind of talks about that and says, don't really worry too much about the difference, but it's where one party relieves the other party of their obligation, and that's really what you need to know about the two of them. I think the book talks about how one is would happen before the contract's in place, and I think the other one after the contract's been in place and they've started. Okay, substantial performance, and we discussed that just in prior, where they do pretty much finish. But and then performance, part of a divisible contract, right? So if we divided the contract, maybe the consultant gets stuff done all in the first 3 months, all done, right? Or maybe that's all you wanted. Okay, so the contract was divided, and they finished part of it, and you agreed to part ways. So a duty of performance under a contract is discharged because of commercial impracticability and impossibility of performance. Sure. Efficient breach. What if you could walk away from an economically harmful contract yet fully compensate the other party? You've breached the contract but made restitution. And I think the book talks about people walking away from mortgages, and we saw that in the financial crisis, right? You bought this house and you borrowed $150,000, and all of a sudden the house is only worth $100,000. Well, what if you just walk down to the bank and hand in the keys, right? Is that an efficient breach? And the answer is, yeah, maybe. Okay, maybe. And with home loans, it's a little bit weird because I'm not going to get into details, but I know there's some different law and case law and whatnot that has to do with homeowners and the deficiencies and whatnot that they might owe. But technically, the bank, if you did that, could sue you, or the finance company could sue you for that $50,000 difference. Okay, and you may or may not owe that, depending on what the courts might decide given the circumstances, right? Okay, and that's as it relates to houses. Vehicles and other loans, you would definitely owe it. Okay, homes, they kind of have a special place in people's hearts, I guess. So on the other hand, I would tell you this, that banks would often, we did this a lot, where somebody was underwater, maybe on their house or whatever, and they were struggling for whatever reason, but they were still very cooperative, and they weren't trying to stick it to the bank. They were just honestly in circumstances that they couldn't complete their contract. They couldn't finish paying for it, so they would sign what was called a deed in lieu of foreclosure. And then the bank would give up their rights to any deficiency or anything like that, and that was an efficient breach. Okay, and that was agreed to by both parties, right? So it was a mutual assent thing, and that happened fairly often. And in my opinion, it was very ethical of the person, right? They worked out an agreement. From the bank standpoint, they didn't have to go through the process of foreclosure and all the other things that would involve, right? Could it harm you in the future? Maybe. Credit ratings and those types of things. I thought about it from the other side. So what if you were agreed to sell, say, some stock to a person, not necessarily on the stock exchange, maybe in a locally closely held company or something, and you agreed to do it in 60 days. Well, all of a sudden you find out in that 60 days that the company's done extremely well and the stock's worth, twice what you agreed to sell it for. So you walk away, and maybe the person had given you a down payment and everything, right? You give them back the money. Is that an efficient breach? Yeah, probably not. The judge is probably going to rule for specific performance and make you sell the stock for that original price. So agency. We have a lot of agency agreements, and think in terms of employment. That's probably the most common, is that principal, right, the company, the owner, the boss, right, the agent's the employee, and they interact with third parties, right? Is there some contractual liability? Yeah. If the agent's authorized, okay, and that's mainly what we're going to discuss here, is what kind of authority and who is authorized. Is the clerk behind the counter at McDonald's authorized to call up McDonald's and order all the food and those types of things and supplies and stuff? Probably not, right? But is the assistant manager? Yeah, probably, right? And so we talk about those and how we set up those types of responsibilities and authorities that happen, okay? We call that agency authority. And there's actual authority, which I kind of describe as being the combination of things, right? A person has actual authority that certainly is expressed and written. It can also be implied authority that a person might have based on their title, okay? And apparent authority, again, based on their title or the circumstances and those types of things, right? Okay, the book describes it, I think, a little bit differently, and it says actual authority is almost like express authority. It's that authority that's been given to you by a boss or an employer or a principal. It doesn't have to be. These are not all employment relationships, so I hope you didn't get that idea. You know, we call a real estate agent, for example, right? That's an agent, and that's an agency agreement where you would hire them. They're not an employee, but you would hire them to sell your house, say, or help you find a house to buy. Okay, they're an agent acting on your behalf, right? As might be an attorney, say, or something like that. Okay, so actual authority, though, is that authority that people have, okay, as a result of the circumstances of their employment or the agreement that they have. And then express and written authority. Maybe good examples of that, too, might be like power of attorney types of agreements. And by the way, I'm not very fond of general power of attorney agreements. I actually saw a lot of people screw, not a lot, but a few, screw their parents or other people who they were caretakers of. You know, they got power of attorney and gave them broad rights to do things, right? So I'm not a fan of that. On the other hand, I'm a pretty big fan maybe of specific powers of attorney, and where I saw that happen often was husband and wife, and wife gets a job and gets transferred to Timbuktu, and husband's going to stay behind and wrap up the affairs here, sell the house, and do those types of things. Well, wife doesn't want to come back and have to sign all the paperwork and everything for the house sale. So what she do, she signs a very specific power of attorney that entitles the husband then to wrap up those affairs that deal with the selling of the house, etc. Okay, very useful in those cases. Okay. Then implied authority is that authority that you might have just based on the circumstances. And again, employee situations are fairly easy to understand. I guess, for example, when I was in banking, you know, my ultimate title is senior vice president. That implies that I could pretty much do a lot of stuff on behalf of the bank, right? And could make lots of agreements, sign contracts, and do things like that, you know, that were implied for the bank. You know, I signed all the advertising contracts, and I signed all those different things like that, in addition to contracts, loans, and whatnot that we had with customers, of course. So, okay, and then apparent authority is that authority that that you think may still exist, and it kind of gave the example in the book that you know, it might be authority that somebody has had, and maybe that person is not in the same circumstances, but you know, unless other parties know that, they might still think that there is apparent authority. We had some cases at the bank that were kind of interesting, where folks, say, worked at businesses, and they would come over and make deposits, but sometimes they would also maybe the deposits were all checks. Well, they would cash some of the checks and take them back because it was supposed to be petty cash. Okay, and they weren't necessarily the owners of the bank or the business or the organization, right? And so those would make you a little bit irpy. And oftentimes we would ask for written agreements, and we would ask for express or written approval for them to do that. Okay. Contracts outside of agent authority. So if somebody made an agreement, you know, it could be ratified if the principal agreed to it. It's basically all that's saying. So tort liability. So we get into that, right? Principals are liable. Know that. Respondeat superior, that'll be on the test for sure, right? So if agents' duties are within the scope of their work, or they're doing things within the scope of their work, the principal's going to be bound. Keep in mind that that's interpreted very, very broadly. Okay, this principal, this agent, or what the scope of the work is interpreted very, very broadly. And you know, I say when I was at the bank, you know, I was 24/7, probably. You know, if I happened to be down at the bar, even if I was there by myself and just enjoying things, and I was buying somebody drinks and I was paying for it myself, it could be interpreted that I was doing that on behalf of the bank. And if that person then went out and, you know, in a drunken state got in a wreck and killed somebody or something, or injured somebody, you know, believe it or not, that could come back to the bank if they thought that I was down there because the person was a customer of the bank, you know, customer of mine, even though I might have been paying for everything myself, right? It's interpreted fairly broadly, and it's when, you know, the example that I just gave you is probably on the edge, okay, of the whole gray area that's there, but it's interpreted fairly broadly, and so I would worry about those things. On the other hand, my employment here at the as a faculty person, I've got pretty broad discretion dealing with students and grades and those types of things, but I have absolutely no financial authority to do anything on behalf of the college, right? And so completely different, right, in how we look at that and what's in the scope of my work, right? I mean, the scope of my work here has nothing to do with finances or anything of the college, etc. Now, on the other hand, if I was driving over to Fort Flathead Community College, or Blackfeet Community College, I'm sorry, Blackfeet Community College, or the Flathead, I guess either one. And I was gonna go over there and talk to them about coming to Northern as juniors and seniors, okay? And I might be driving my own car, I might be doing some things, but if I got in a wreck and hurt somebody else, the college in a case like that might well be, even if I was acting irresponsibly, the college would probably be held accountable. So, okay, and colleges, I mean, they carry insurance or they're self-insured through the state for those types of things. Understanding contracts, yeah, critical. It's critical. Applies to both your personal and professional life. You're gonna have contracts throughout your life. Sorry, that's just the way it's gonna be, right? Okay. When's the last time you went through an entire day without some sort of a contract? Probably never. Okay. So ends that lesson for the day. So 26 minutes, we did pretty good. Thanks, and good luck on test number 3, and we'll talk to you next week.